Deception and Death. Leonard Braxton had always believed in careful planning. He was not a man who acted on impulse. Every move, every word, every detail was designed with precision. A misplaced sentence, an unnecessary emotion. These could lead to suspicion, and suspicion was something he could never afford. His method was tried and tested, a meticulous pattern perfected over time. He would become someone else, adopting a new identity as easily as slipping into a fresh suit. His past would be erased, rewritten into whatever story suited his next victim. To them, he was always the ideal man, charming, attentive, and just lonely enough to make them feel special. Leonard? What a lovely name, Elaine had said on their first evening together. She had hesitated before allowing him to sit at her table in the seaside hotel restaurant, but she had not refused. That was the first sign that she was perfect. He had smiled, tilting his head just slightly, appearing both confident and a little vulnerable. Vulnerability was key. It made women like Elaine feel needed. "It means brave lion," he had replied smoothly. "My mother always said I was destined for great things." Elaine had laughed softly. "And were you?" "Not in the way she imagined," he had said, his voice warm and teasing. "But I like to think I've made a good life for myself." It was a harmless conversation, but in those few minutes, he had already assessed her. She was reserved, but not completely withdrawn. She had money. Her jewelry alone told him that. And more importantly, she was alone. No family, no close friends. That was the first rule. A woman like Elaine could disappear without too many people asking questions. It was the same with Margaret before her, and Joanne. They had all been carefully chosen. Once he had found his target, he would begin the seduction. He never rushed it. There was no need. The right words, the perfect gestures, a touch of chivalry, holding a door open, offering a coat on a chilly evening. Simple things. Elaine had been hesitant at first, but hesitation was merely an invitation for persistence. "You don't trust easily, do you?" he had asked one evening, watching her fingers tighten around the stem of her wine glass. She had smiled, but it was guarded. "Is that a bad thing?" "Not at all," he had assured her. "It means when you do trust, it means something." He had leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "I'd like to be someone you trust, Elaine." And just like that, she had softened. A woman like her had spent her life being cautious, careful. But deep down, she wanted someone to take that caution away, to make her believe in something more. When the time was right, he would begin weaving his own vulnerability into the story. He was a man who had been unlucky in love, a man who had lost someone dear to him, a man who, despite his success, longed for something real. With Margaret, it had been a lost fiancée, a tragic accident that had left him wary of love. With Joanne, it had been a difficult divorce, a wife who had never truly understood him. With Elaine, it was a career that had taken up too much of his life, leaving no room for love, until now. And they believed him. They always did. The proposal always came quickly, but never too quickly. Just soon enough to make them feel breathless, as if they had been swept into a whirlwind romance, something they had never expected, but now couldn't imagine living without. "Are you sure?" Elaine had asked when he proposed under the soft glow of a street lamp, the ocean waves murmuring behind them. He had taken her hands in his, looking into her eyes with practiced sincerity. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." She had looked away, flustered, overwhelmed. "It's just, I never imagined." "Neither did I," he had murmured, lifting one of her hands to his lips. "But when something feels right, you don't question it. You hold on to it." And she had said yes. They always did. The will was the next step. It had to feel natural, not forced. "I know it's a little strange," he had said a few hours after they were married, as they sat together in the small rented house. "But I think we should make sure everything is in order, just in case." Elaine had frowned. "Just in case?" "You never know what life will bring," he had said lightly. And I don't want anything to happen to you without knowing you're protected. And if anything were to happen to me, I'd want you to have everything. I don't have family. There's no one else I'd trust with my affairs." She had hesitated. That was expected. But hesitation wasn't refusal. It was simply another step in the dance. "You don't have to decide now," he had said gently, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Just think about it." Within a few days, she had agreed. She had thought about it, convinced herself it was the right thing to do. Margaret had done the same. So had Joanne. And just like them, Elaine had walked willingly into his web, unaware of the fate that awaited her. Leonard Braxton was a master of deception. He didn't just kill, he orchestrated. He planned. And most importantly, he never left loose ends. At least that's what he believed. But this time, the game was different. And the pattern that had once been his greatest strength was about to become his greatest weakness. Leonard Braxton understood one fundamental truth about human nature. People craved to be seen, to be valued. And for the women he chose, that need was even more profound. They had spent years being overlooked, dismissed, or simply fading into the background of their own lives. He knew how to change that. He made them feel important, special, desired. And once they were wrapped in that illusion, they belonged to him. Elaine had been no different. When he first spotted her sitting alone at the seaside hotel restaurant, she had the posture of someone who had grown used to loneliness. Her eyes barely lifted from her book, her fingers toyed absently with her necklace, and every now and then, she let out a small sigh, as if she had resigned herself to a quiet, uneventful evening. That was the kind of woman Leonard looked for. He approached her table with the careful balance of confidence and warmth. Not too eager, that would raise her guard. Not too indifferent, that wouldn't make her feel special. "Excuse me," he said, letting his voice carry the faintest hint of uncertainty. "I was hoping to have dinner without staring at an empty chair all night. May I join you?" Elaine hesitated, blinking up at him. He could already see the thought forming in her mind, "Why me?" It was the question they all asked themselves. "I don't usually," she started, but he cut her off gently. "Just dinner," he said, flashing a reassuring smile. "No expectations, no obligations. Just two people enjoying a meal." That was all it took. With a small, almost embarrassed nod, she gestured to the seat across from her. He was in. Over the next few days, he unraveled her. Not with force, not with manipulation she could recognize, but with an intoxicating blend of attention, curiosity, and admiration. He listened. More than that, he made her feel heard. "Tell me about yourself," he had said one evening as they walked along the quiet beach. She had laughed, shaking her head. "There's not much to tell." "Of course there is." He had nudged her playfully, keeping his tone light. "A woman who reads alone in a restaurant, who stares out at the sea as if it holds all the answers. I don't believe for a second that your life is ordinary." She had blushed at that. Another sign of how little she was used to being noticed. "There was a time I had dreams," she admitted. "I wanted to travel, to teach in different countries. But then my father got sick, and, well, life has a way of making choices for you, doesn't it?" Leonard had sighed, shaking his head. "You gave up your own happiness for someone else's. That says a lot about the kind of person you are." She had looked at him then, eyes soft, a little vulnerable. He held that gaze just long enough to make her heart quicken. That was how it started. From that moment, he became the thing missing from her life. The admiration she had never received, the adventure she had never taken, the love she had never truly known. He crafted himself into her perfect man, slipping seamlessly into the shape of what she needed. When she spoke about books, he listened as though every word fascinated him. When she talked about her past, he offered sympathy without pity. When she laughed, he made sure he laughed with her, mirroring her joy as if it were his own. And when he touched her, just a fleeting brush of his fingers against hers, a casual press of his hand against the small of her back, it was always just enough to make her wonder, to make her long for more. He gave her what she didn't even realize she was desperate for: affection, attention, significance. Soon, she was the one reaching for him. She began to wait for him at dinner. She searched for him in a crowd. When he wasn't near, she felt his absence like an ache. And once she needed him, truly needed him, he knew she was ready for the next step. "You make me feel alive again," she whispered one evening as they sat on the hotel balcony, the moonlight casting silver over the ocean waves. He turned to her, letting a pause stretch between them, as if her words had moved something deep within him. Then he reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips with slow, deliberate tenderness. "You are alive, Elaine," he murmured. "More than you know," she sighed, leaning into him. She was his. The financial part of it was almost too easy. Once a woman was emotionally dependent on him, practical things like money seemed trivial in comparison. "It's funny," she mused one afternoon as they walked through town. "I never thought I'd meet someone like you at this point in my life." Leonard chuckled, squeezing her hand. "Love has a way of surprising us." She smiled, looking down. "You must think I'm foolish." "Why would I ever think that?" "Because I barely know you," she admitted. "And yet, I feel like I do." That was the magic of it. The illusion of fate. He had made her believe that their meeting wasn't orchestrated, that their love wasn't manufactured. She trusted him, and that trust was the key to everything. So when he casually brought up financial security, when he mentioned how important it was to plan for the future, she didn't suspect. When he suggested they ensure everything was in order, just in case, she believed it was for their love, not his greed. She let him in, and once he had control, there was no escape. That was the brilliance of his plan. His victims never saw the trap until it was too late, until they were already drowning. Elaine had always found silence comforting. The quiet hum of an empty house, the stillness of an afternoon spent alone with a book. These were things she had grown used to. Even after her father passed, leaving her the large house, with its heavy drapes and untouched rooms, she had never truly felt lonely. Or at least, that's what she had told herself. But Leonard made her question that. "You must have so many friends back home," he had said once, his voice light but probing. Elaine had smiled, shaking her head. "Not really. I was always busy taking care of my father. I lost touch with most people." Leonard had sighed, squeezing her hand. "That's a shame. A woman like you deserves to be surrounded by love." It was such a simple statement, but it lingered in her mind. She had never thought of it that way before. She had always been independent, self-sufficient. She had never needed anyone. But Leonard made her feel like she should need someone. That maybe, just maybe, being alone all these years had been a mistake. That was how it started. Leonard was patient. He didn't rush things. He let her feel the absence of companionship, let her sit in the silence of her own life, and question whether it was truly enough. Then, once the idea had settled, he became the only voice she wanted to hear. He encouraged her to leave behind the things that connected her to her old life. The occasional letters from an old colleague, they never really made time for you, did they? The yearly phone calls from a distant cousin, if they cared, wouldn't they call more often? Even the book club she had attended once a month, you always said it wasn't that exciting. Why waste your time? At first it seemed innocent, logical even. She had outgrown those relationships. And Leonard was right. None of them had truly been there for her. Not like he was. Soon, she found herself depending on him for company, for conversation, for warmth. She didn't notice how her world had shrunk, how the familiar faces she once saw in passing had disappeared. She only noticed him. And that was exactly what Leonard wanted. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their rented house, Elaine looked out at the dimly lit street, a frown tugging at her lips. "The neighbors moved in next door today," she said, watching a couple unload boxes from their car. Leonard's hand on hers was steady, reassuring. "We should keep to ourselves, don't you think? I mean, we don't know what kind of people they are." Elaine hesitated. "I suppose you're right. I just thought maybe it wouldn't hurt to be friendly. Leonard turned to her then, his expression soft but serious. Elaine, we finally have our own little world. Just you and me. Isn't that what we always wanted? She smiled, leaning into him. It is. That was the moment she stopped thinking about anyone else. Leonard had done this before. He knew how to keep a woman wrapped in his world, how to close the doors to everything else, so that when the time came, no one would be looking for her. Margaret had been the same way. A quiet woman with no family, no close friends. When she died in that rented house up north, no one had come knocking. No one had questioned it. It was simply an unfortunate accident, a brief tragedy that faded with time. Joan had been trickier. Her brother had shown up at the funeral, his eyes sharp with suspicion. That had been messy, complicated. Leonard had learned from it. Elaine was perfect. No one would question a thing. One night, Elaine sat in the dimly lit living room, the sound of rain tapping against the windows. Leonard was reading, his legs stretched out on the couch. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked suddenly. Leonard looked up, smiling. "All the time?" "No, I mean," she hesitated. "What if something happens to one of us? We've built this life together. It would be awful if one of us was left alone." Leonard set his book down, watching her carefully. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. "You're right," he said gently. "I never want to think about losing you. But it would be wise to make sure we're prepared. Just in case." Elaine nodded. "Maybe we should update our wills. Make sure everything goes to each other." Leonard reached for her hand, his thumb tracing soothing circles on her skin. "That's a beautiful idea, my love. It means we'll always take care of each other." Elaine smiled, comforted by the thought. She didn't notice the gleam in Leonard's eyes, the satisfaction hidden behind his affectionate gaze. She had just sealed her fate. The bathroom was small but functional, with pale blue tiles that reflected the soft glow of the ceiling light. The tub, old but deep, sat against the far wall beneath a small, frosted window. Leonard stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the room with a calculating expression. This would be the place. This would be where Elaine's life would end. He had done this before. He knew exactly how it had to be set up. No room for errors, no miscalculations. He stepped inside and reached up, brushing his fingers against the electric heater mounted on the wall just above the bathtub. The old wiring was exposed in places, a detail that worked perfectly in his favor. To anyone else, it would look like a simple accident, a tragic misfortune that took the life of an unsuspecting woman. Elaine's routine made it easy. Every evening, without fail, she would fill the tub with warm water, pour in lavender-scented bath oil, and soak for at least 30 minutes. She had always enjoyed her solitude, even in marriage. Leonard had made sure to encourage it. "You should take more time for yourself," he had told her one evening as she sat beside him on the couch, a book resting on her lap. Elaine had smiled at him. "You think so?" "Of course," he had said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You give so much, Elaine. You deserve to be pampered." She had sighed, leaning against his shoulder. "Maybe you're right." That was all it took, a simple push in the right direction. From then on, she had made her baths a ritual, a quiet time she looked forward to every night. And now it would be her undoing. Leonard spent the next afternoon making subtle adjustments. The heater had been mounted for years, but the screws were loose. With just the right amount of force, it would fall. The faulty wiring would ensure a spark. The water would take care of the rest. He tested the screws, turning them gently between his fingers. Loose enough to slip free with the right amount of weight, but not so obvious that an inspector would notice tampering. He stepped back, surveying his work. Perfect. That evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Elaine's soft laughter filled the room. "You're in a good mood tonight," Leonard observed, watching her over the rim of his wine glass. She shrugged. "I don't know, I just feel content." His lips curled into a smile. "That's all I ever wanted for you." She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "I really do love you, Leonard." He squeezed back, his grip just firm enough to be reassuring. "And I love you, Elaine." Later that night, she hummed to herself as she filled the tub, steam rising in delicate swirls. Leonard lingered outside the bathroom door, listening to the sound of water sloshing against porcelain. "Do you need anything, darling?" he called. "No, I'm fine," she answered cheerfully. "I'll be out soon." He hesitated for a moment, then took a step back. Not yet. Patience was everything. He couldn't afford mistakes. He had to let her settle into the routine for a few more nights, let her trust that nothing was wrong. When the time was right, when she was completely relaxed, when she had let her guard down entirely, then he would strike. A few days later, the moment presented itself. Elaine had been quiet all evening, lost in thought. Leonard had noticed. "Something on your mind?" he asked as they cleared the dishes. She hesitated before responding. "I had the strangest feeling, today." He stilled. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Like someone was watching me?" Leonard forced a chuckle. "You've been reading too many mystery novels." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Maybe." He wrapped his arms around her shoulders, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Why don't you take a nice long bath? Relax." She let out a soft sigh. "That does sound nice." Leonard kissed her temple. "Go on, I'll take care of everything else." She squeezed his hand before heading upstairs. Leonard followed at a distance, watching as she disappeared into the bathroom, the door clicking shut behind her. He waited until he heard the water running, the familiar splash as she stepped into the tub. Then, with a steady breath, he reached up and placed his hand against the heater. A slight nudge, just enough pressure. The screws gave way. A second later, the heater tilted, wires sparking as it tumbled forward. A sharp gasp echoed from inside the bathroom. Then nothing. Leonard allowed himself a slow exhale, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with exhilaration. It was done. Elaine had never been the type to question things too much. Life had shaped her into someone who accepted what came her way, who didn't argue when people made decisions for her. But something about Leonard, about the way he moved, the way he spoke, had begun to feel off. It started with the will. It had been a week after their wedding. They were sitting in a cozy little cafe, a place Leonard had chosen, where the walls were lined with bookshelves, and soft jazz played in the background. Elaine had been stirring her tea absent-mindedly when Leonard reached across the table and took her hand. "I've been thinking, darling," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "Now that we're married, we should take care of the practical things. You know, for security." Elaine glanced up at him. "What do you mean?" "I will," he said simply. "It's important that we take care of each other. If anything were to happen to me, I'd want you to have everything. And I'd feel so much better knowing I'd be taken care of too." Elaine blinked. "A will? Already?" Leonard chuckled, squeezing her fingers. "It's just common sense, my love. We're in this together now. Wouldn't you want to make sure I'm protected?" Something in his voice made her hesitate. Of course, it was logical. A will was a normal thing for a married couple to have. But why the rush? They had barely settled into their life together, and he was already thinking about death? "I suppose," she murmured, still uncertain. Leonard tilted his head, watching her closely. "Is something wrong?" No, she said quickly. "It's just, I never really thought about it. That's why you have me," he said with a warm smile. "I take care of the things you don't have to worry about." And that was the thing about Leonard. He had a way of making everything sound so reasonable, so right. By the time they finished their tea, she had agreed. The lawyer Leonard chose was a man in his late 50s, with sharp eyes and a thin mustache. He asked a few standard questions, drafted the documents, and within days, everything was signed. Elaine left the office feeling uneasy, though she couldn't quite place why. But the feeling didn't go away. It was little things at first. The way Leonard always asked about her bank account but never spoke about his own. The way he casually brought up her assets in conversation. The way he seemed to know exactly how much money she had, down to the last pound. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he asked, "You never told me, Elaine. Do you keep your money in a joint account, or do you prefer handling it separately?" Elaine looked up from her book. "Why do you ask?" Leonard gave an easy smile. "Just curious. Some couples share everything. I think it's rather romantic, don't you?" She hesitated. "I've always managed my own finances." "Of course," he nodded. "I respect that. I just think, well, if we're truly sharing our lives, it makes sense to trust each other completely. No secrets." Elaine forced a smile. No secrets. But the unease grew. One day, while dusting the bookshelf in the study, she found a small stack of papers tucked away beneath a pile of old letters. Curious, she unfolded one of them. Her heart stopped. It was a life insurance policy. Her name was printed in bold letters at the top. The beneficiary? Leonard Braxton. Her throat went dry. "Elaine?" She spun around, the papers slipping from her fingers. Leonard stood in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. I was just cleaning," she stammered, forcing a laugh. Leonard stepped forward, his gaze dropping to the documents on the floor. For a split second, something flashed in his eyes. Then he smiled. "Ah, I was going to tell you about that." She swallowed. "Tell me what?" "I took out a small policy," he said smoothly. "Just in case. It's nothing to worry about, love. Just another way of making sure we're both secure." "But why only in my name?" Leonard didn't blink. "Because I handle the finances, remember? If something happens to me, everything I have goes to you. This is just a way to balance it out." Elaine nodded slowly, but inside, panic tightened around her chest. That night, as Leonard slept beside her, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. Something wasn't right. The will, the life insurance, the way he always seemed so interested in what she owned, what she was worth. Her mind raced back to something she had read in the newspaper weeks ago. A woman who had died suddenly in her bath. A woman with no family. A woman whose husband had collected a large sum of money afterward. Elaine turned her head, staring at the man beside her. Her pulse quickened. She had made a terrible mistake. Elaine wasn't the only one growing suspicious of Leonard Braxton. Unbeknownst to him, the quiet couple who had moved into the house next door were not what they seemed. Detective Inspector James Carter and his partner, Detective Sophie Langley, had been following Leonard for months. They had studied his past, tracing his steps through different towns, different names, and different widows who had died far too soon. His previous marriages had been written off as tragic accidents, but Carter had a gut feeling. Leonard Braxton was a killer. They needed evidence. Solid, undeniable proof. That's why they had moved into the house next door, pretending to be an ordinary married couple, blending into the background like any other neighbors. They had chosen the perfect cover. Carter was now Daniel Whitmore, a middle-aged insurance salesman, and Langley was Emma Whitmore, his soft-spoken wife who enjoyed gardening. From the moment they settled in, they watched. Leonard had no idea. One evening, Carter stood by the living room window, pretending to sip his tea while his eyes tracked Leonard's movements through a gap in the curtains. Leonard was in his own living room, reading a newspaper, his expression calm, composed. "He's too confident," Carter murmured. Langley, who was flipping through a book at the dining table, didn't look up. "They always are." Carter exhaled slowly. "We need to get inside that house." Langley finally glanced up. "And how exactly do you suggest we do that?" "Walk up to the door and ask for a cup of sugar." Carter smirked. "Something like that." The opportunity came sooner than they expected. The next morning, as Carter was heading out under the guise of going to work, he saw Elaine standing at the garden gate. She looked tired, worn down. There was something in her eyes that made him pause. "Morning," he greeted with a friendly nod. Elaine offered a weak smile. "Good morning." Carter hesitated for only a second before saying, "If you ever need anything, my wife and I are right next door." Moving into a new place can be overwhelming. Elaine's smile wavered. She looked as though she wanted to say something, but instead, she just nodded and murmured, "Thank you." Then she turned back toward the house, her shoulders tense. Carter knew that look. Fear. He walked back inside and found Langley pouring herself a cup of coffee. "She's scared," he said. Langley raised an eyebrow. "Elaine?" He nodded. "Something's not right. I think she's starting to figure him out." Langley set down her cup. "Then we need to make contact." That evening, as Langley pretended to trim the rose bushes in their garden, she spotted Elaine stepping outside. Taking a chance, she offered a warm smile. "Hi there. I'm Emma, from next door. We haven't really had a chance to talk." Elaine hesitated before giving a polite nod. "Elaine?" Langley wiped her hands on her gardening gloves. "It's lovely to meet you. My husband and I just moved in. Still getting used to the place." Elaine glanced toward the house. Her husband wasn't outside. She looked back at Langley, as if weighing a decision. Finally, she spoke. "How do you find the neighborhood?" Langley shrugged. "Quiet. Safe, I suppose. You?" Elaine's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know yet." Langley caught the guarded tone. "Well, if you ever need a chat, I'm around." She hesitated, then added casually, "My husband works in insurance. If you ever need any advice on policies, he's happy to help." The reaction was subtle, but telling. Elaine's fingers tensed against the wooden fence. A flicker of something, fear perhaps, passed through her eyes before she forced another smile. "That's good to know," she murmured. Langley didn't push. She just nodded and went back to her roses. But in her mind, the pieces were falling into place. That night, she relayed the conversation to Carter. "She knows something," she said. "She just doesn't know if she can trust us." Carter leaned back in his chair, considering. "We need to make sure she doesn't end up like the others." Langley exhaled. "Then we wait for Leonard to make his move. And when he does..." Carter's jaw tightened. "We'll be ready." What they didn't know was that Leonard was already planning. The pieces of his deadly puzzle were already being arranged. And time was running out. Elaine sat in the corner of the small cafe, the cup of coffee in front of her cold and forgotten. Her fingers traced the rim of the cup absently, her mind lost in thought. She hadn't expected this. When she'd first met Leonard, everything had seemed so perfect, so effortless. He was charming, attentive, the kind of man any woman would feel lucky to have. But lately, something didn't sit right. There were moments when he was distant, when his smile seemed too practiced, too rehearsed. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach that something was off, and the longer they were together, the more her suspicions grew. So she decided to take matters into her own hands. She had always trusted her instincts, and this time they were screaming at her. Instead of confronting Leonard directly, she decided to dig deeper, quietly, subtly. No accusations just yet. She needed to know more. Elaine had taken the first step a few days ago, visiting the local police station under the guise of asking about neighborhood safety. The officer behind the desk had been polite, a little bored. But when she casually dropped Leonard's name into the conversation, his reaction had been telling. He'd stiffened ever so slightly before directing her to a public records officer. After all, anyone could request information on past incidents. She had waited for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 15 minutes, as the officer looked through records on the computer. Elaine's heart had begun to race in her chest, her hands sweaty and trembling. What if she was wrong? What if she was just overthinking things? The officer's voice broke through her thoughts. "You're looking into Mr. Leonard Davis, right?" he asked, glancing up from the screen. Elaine nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, that's him." The officer frowned, a shadow passing over his face. "Well, we don't have any active complaints or anything like that, but I'll be honest. His history isn't exactly clean." Elaine's pulse quickened, her breath catching. "What do you mean?" The officer cleared his throat, leaning in slightly. Leonard Davis has been married 3 times before. All 3 marriages ended in, well, let's just say there were allegations. Abuse, manipulation, control. None of the women ever pressed charges, but there were enough reports to raise a red flag. Elaine felt the blood drain from her face. She had always known something wasn't quite right about him, but this? It was a slap to the face. 3 marriages? All ending the same way? What kind of allegations? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The officer hesitated before answering. Emotional and psychological abuse. One of his ex-wives claimed he would manipulate her into thinking she was crazy, isolate her from friends and family. The other 2 reported similar behaviors. None of them ever wanted to press charges, but they left him for their own reasons. Elaine had thanked the officer, her legs weak as she left the station, her mind racing with the new information. Leonard had never mentioned any of this, but now that she knew, everything made sense. The way he would occasionally snap when he thought she wasn't paying enough attention to him, how he would make offhand comments about her friends, her family. She wasn't imagining it. She had been warned, and now she had to act on it. Later that night, as she sat in her apartment, Elaine replayed the officer's words in her mind. 3 marriages, all of them ending badly. And yet, Leonard seemed so normal, so charming. How could someone who appeared so perfect on the outside be hiding such a dark past? It was then that an idea began to form in her mind, something devious, something clever. She wouldn't confront him directly. No, that would be too dangerous. Instead, she would use what she knew to set a trap. Leonard wouldn't see it coming, and she would get the answers she needed without ever having to put herself at risk. Elaine's plan was simple. She would pretend everything was fine. She would act like she had no idea about his past, no inkling of what he had done before. She would continue to play the role of the sweet, trusting girlfriend, but underneath, she would be gathering evidence. She would keep him close, watch his every move, and see if she could catch him in a lie, or even better, if she could uncover the truth he was hiding. The next day, she acted as if nothing had changed. Leonard called her, sounding as charming as ever. "Hey, beautiful," he said, his voice smooth and warm. "How was your day?" Elaine smiled softly, playing her part. "It was fine, just the usual. How about you?" "Oh, you know," Leonard replied, a chuckle in his voice. Same old, same old. I was thinking maybe we could go out for dinner tonight. Just the 2 of us. What do you think?" Elaine hesitated, but only for a moment. "That sounds nice. I'd like that." The date went off without a hitch. Leonard was, as always, the perfect gentleman. But as Elaine sat across from him, watching him talk animatedly about some new project at work, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was sitting across from a stranger. This man, who smiled so effortlessly, who whispered sweet things in her ear, who made her feel like she was the center of his world. Was he hiding something darker beneath the surface? It wasn't until later that evening, as they walked back to her apartment, that Elaine spotted her opportunity. Leonard had let his guard down, just for a moment. As they passed a small park near her place, he casually mentioned something about an ex-wife he'd bumped into recently. Elaine raised an eyebrow, feigning curiosity. "Really? An ex-wife? Which one?" He shifted uncomfortably, but covered it with a laugh. "Oh, just the one I was with before I met you. We had a complicated relationship. But that's all behind me now. I'm happy with you." Elaine's heart skipped a beat. An ex-wife? This was the first she'd heard of it, and it didn't match up with anything he'd told her before. "Oh," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I didn't realize you had more than one." Leonard's eyes flickered nervously. "Yeah, well, I don't usually talk about that stuff." Elaine smiled sweetly, her mind working overtime. She had him now. The trap was set, and soon she would have all the answers. Elaine sat at her kitchen table late that night, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard of her laptop, but she couldn't seem to make herself type. The weight of what she had learned about Leonard's past marriages hung heavily in the air, suffocating the space around her. He had been so perfect, so smooth in his words, that it had taken her a while to see the cracks in his facade. But now, she had evidence. She knew his history, and she was more certain than ever that she had to act before it was too late. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The thought of what might happen if she were wrong made her stomach churn, but the thought of not doing anything at all was even worse. Leonard's manipulations had already started to creep into her life in small, almost imperceptible ways. She had no illusions anymore. If she didn't take control of this, if she didn't protect herself, she might be the next name on a list of victims. She leaned forward and took a deep breath. The decision had been made. She had to write the letter. The cursor blinked at her from the screen, a silent challenge. With a steady hand, she began to type. Dear Officer Thompson, I hope this letter finds you well. I'm writing to provide you with crucial information regarding a man named Leonard Davis, whom I have been involved with romantically for the past several months. I'm afraid I've come to believe that he may be a danger to me, as well as to others he has been involved with in the past. As you may know, Leonard Davis has a history of problematic relationships. I've recently discovered that he has been married 3 times before, and each of those marriages ended under troubling circumstances. According to public records and the information I gathered from the police department, his ex-wives have alleged emotional and psychological abuse. While none of the women pressed formal charges, there were numerous reports of Leonard's behavior, including manipulation, isolation, and control. I am attaching copies of my notes from the conversations I've had with local officers regarding Leonard's history. It's important to note that he has always seemed charming, attentive, and affectionate, almost too much so at times. I've started to notice that whenever I question him about his past, especially his marriages, he becomes defensive and evasive. Recently, he even slipped up and mentioned an ex-wife he had never mentioned before, which seemed odd to me, given how little he usually discusses his personal history. I have reason to believe that Leonard might be hiding something, and I fear it may be far worse than what I've already uncovered. For your reference, I've also attached a list of places Leonard has mentioned visiting in recent weeks, as well as several photographs of the 2 of us taken at various locations. Should anything happen to me, I want this letter to serve as evidence that Leonard had the motive, means, and opportunity to harm me. If I disappear or something happens to me, please consider this my formal warning. I do not trust Leonard, and I believe he may resort to violence to cover up whatever he's hiding. I've taken the precaution of sharing this information with a trusted friend as well. They have a copy of this letter, and I've made arrangements to ensure that they will contact you should anything go wrong. Please do not underestimate the gravity of my suspicions. I trust you will look into this matter thoroughly. Sincerely, Elaine Parker. Elaine stared at the screen, her fingers trembling slightly as she read over the letter. Every word felt like it had cost her something: her peace of mind, her safety, her trust in the man she had once believed would be her future. But she had done the right thing. She had to keep herself safe. She had to make sure that if anything happened to her, Leonard would have no escape. This letter was her insurance, a safety net woven from truth, intelligence, and courage. She hit send, and the letter was on its way. The knot in her stomach loosened just a little, but not enough to ease her mind completely. Leonard was still out there, still lying, still playing his game. And for all she knew, he might be watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The sound of her phone vibrating on the table startled her. It was a message from Leonard. Hey, I was thinking about you. I miss you. Want to meet up tomorrow? Elaine's heart beat faster. The message seemed harmless on the surface, but she had learned to read between the lines with Leonard. He was testing her, checking to see if she was still under his control. He knew how to charm, how to manipulate, how to make her feel like the only woman in the world. But that man wasn't real, not anymore. Elaine's fingers hovered over her phone for a moment. She wanted to ignore him, to block him out completely, but she couldn't afford to make any hasty decisions. Not yet. Instead, she typed a calm, measured reply. "I'm fine, Leonard. I'll be in touch later." She sent it and set the phone aside, her mind spinning with everything she had just done. It was a risky move. Sending the letter to the police without confronting him first could make things worse. He might become paranoid violent. But at least now, she had a way out. She had laid her cards on the table, and Leonard no longer had the upper hand. The weight of what she had done didn't hit her until later, when she was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling in the dark. She had never felt more vulnerable. The letter was out there, in the hands of the police. There was no going back now. Elaine turned over and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. It wasn't just the letter that kept her up. It was the knowledge that Leonard was capable of far more than she had initially realized. And now, for better or worse, she was on his radar. The morning would bring new challenges, new risks. But for now, all she could do was wait. She had done what needed to be done. She had sealed his fate, and she could only hope that it would be enough. Elaine had never been one to shy away from challenges, but as she stepped into Leonard's luxurious apartment that evening, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Everything about this place screamed opulence and control. Fancy artwork on the walls, expensive furniture, and the faint scent of expensive cologne. It was all part of the facade, the same one he had used to lure her in, to make her feel safe, adored. But she knew better now. "Elaine," Leonard greeted her, his voice smooth and soothing as always, a smile curling on his lips. "You look stunning tonight. I thought we could relax." "You deserve it." Elaine forced a smile. "Thanks, Leonard. I appreciate the gesture, but I'm a little tired." He tilted his head, a glimmer of suspicion flashing in his eyes. "Tired? It's been a long week, hasn't it? Why don't you let me pamper you a bit? I've prepared something special." She wanted to refuse, to leave, but she couldn't, at least not yet. She had to stay close, gather more information. He was playing a game, but she was playing one too. Leonard led her into the bathroom, where a large, steaming bath awaited her. The soft scent of lavender filled the air, and the water sparkled under the dim, ambient lighting. It looked inviting, relaxing even, but Elaine's instincts screamed at her to be cautious. This was no ordinary bath. This was Leonard's way of trying to control the situation, to get her into a vulnerable position where she couldn't escape. "Go ahead, darling. The water's just the right temperature," he coaxed, his hands resting on her shoulders in that too familiar, possessive way. "I'll leave you to unwind. I'm just outside if you need anything." Elaine's mind raced. Leonard had been getting more distant lately, more controlling. He'd stopped pretending to be the perfect boyfriend and had started showing his true colors, slipping up in conversation, getting defensive when she asked too many questions about his past. And now this bath, this strange, almost too precious offering, it felt like a trap. She smiled, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her calm facade. "Thanks, Leonard. I'll be fine." Once Leonard left the room, closing the door behind him, Elaine wasted no time. She knew she didn't have much. Her instincts had kicked in the moment she'd stepped into the bathroom, and now she was certain. This bath was designed to make her drop her guard, to lull her into a sense of security so Leonard could make his next move. But not this time. She had already seen the cracks in his mask. He thought she was the prey, but tonight she would turn the tables. Instead of undressing and slipping into the bath, Elaine silently moved to the window. She had memorized the layout of the apartment, and from what she could tell, there was a small kitchen roof just beneath it, accessible from the bathroom. It wasn't much of a climb, but it was her only chance. If Leonard had set this up as part of some grand plan, she needed to escape before he could follow through. The window creaked open with a soft push, but Elaine's heart was pounding in her chest. She could almost hear Leonard's footsteps outside the door, and she knew that any second now, he might return. Carefully, she climbed out the window and onto the narrow ledge, keeping herself balanced as she edged toward the kitchen roof. The night air bit at her skin, but she was too focused to notice the chill. With a final push, she hoisted herself up onto the roof, barely making a sound as she landed. She had escaped. But it wasn't over yet. She crouched low, watching the bathroom window, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could hear Leonard's voice through the door, muffled, but still distinct. He was talking to himself, muttering about how she'd fall for it, how she'd relax, how everything was going according to plan. But as he spoke, something clicked in Elaine's mind. His words, his overconfidence, it was all part of his ego. Leonard thought she was just a pawn, a naive girl who would fall into his trap. He hadn't even considered that she might outsmart him. In his arrogance, he'd underestimated her. It didn't take long for Leonard to re-enter the bathroom, calling out to her, his voice heavy with false concern. "Elaine? Is everything okay in there? You've been quiet for a while." Elaine's lips curled into a small, defiant smile. She'd had enough. It was time to change the game. She ducked low, making her way across the roof, heading toward the back of the building. From here, she could get to the alley and disappear before Leonard had a chance to react. But just as she was about to turn the corner of the building, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Leonard was on the move. He was coming for her, and the hunt was on. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elaine wasn't afraid. She was ready. She had anticipated his every move. The way he had so carefully orchestrated everything, thinking it would be foolproof, had only made her more determined to outwit him. She ran, keeping to the shadows, as Leonard's footsteps grew louder. She could hear him shouting her name now, frantic. But it didn't matter. The power had shifted. The predator was now the prey. Leonard had underestimated her, and it was his downfall. Elaine took a sharp turn into the alley and slowed down, breathing heavily but with purpose. She could hear him closer now, his voice cutting through the night air. But she had a head start. The tables had turned. For the first time, she wasn't the one trapped in a cage of his making. She was free. When Leonard rounded the corner, panting and furious, Elaine was already gone, blending into the city's nightscape. He stood there for a moment, looking around, his eyes scanning the darkness, his expression twisting into confusion and rage. He had been so sure, so confident. But now the hunter was the hunted, and Elaine had outsmarted him at his own game. Elaine stood at the corner of the street, her back pressed against the cool brick of the building. She had barely caught her breath after escaping Leonard's apartment, and yet she knew there was no time to waste. Her heart still pounded in her chest, but there was a fire inside her now, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. The plan was set. The police were on their way, and all she had to do was wait. She glanced nervously at her phone. Her message to Officer Thompson had been clear, detailing everything she knew about Leonard, all the evidence, all the lies. But this wasn't just about gathering information anymore. This was the endgame, and as much as she hated to admit it, she knew she couldn't let Leonard slip through her fingers again. Not this time. She had outsmarted him once, but now it was up to the police to finish what she had started. She could hear the sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. It was happening. The moment of reckoning was finally here. Minutes passed like hours as Elaine's mind raced through every detail. Leonard had always been so confident, so sure of his ability to manipulate and control. His charm, his smile. It had all been a mask, a carefully crafted illusion to keep everyone in his orbit. Even she had fallen for it. But not anymore. She had seen through the cracks, through the lies he'd built his world on. And now, it was time for him to face the truth. A few blocks away, the police cars screeched to a halt in front of Leonard's building. Officers flooded out of their vehicles, their uniforms stark against the darkness of the night. Elaine watched from her spot, hidden in the shadows, her breath catching in her throat as she saw them march toward the entrance. It was surreal, almost poetic, the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when Leonard's empire of lies crumbled to dust. Then it happened. The door to Leonard's apartment exploded inward with a force that sent a chill down Elaine's spine. The sound of officers shouting commands echoed through the building, followed by the heavy thud of boots on the hardwood floors. Elaine's pulse quickened, but there was a part of her that couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Leonard had spent years avoiding suspicion, building his life on manipulation and deception. He had thought he was untouchable. He had thought he could control everything, including her. But now, his arrogance had led him straight into the trap. Inside the apartment, Leonard's calm, collected demeanor was gone. Panic and confusion painted his face as the officers surrounded him. He stood frozen for a moment, his eyes darting between them as if he still couldn't believe it was happening. "What is this?" Leonard demanded, his voice dripping with disbelief. "What's going on here? I haven't done anything." One of the officers, a tall man with a stern face, stepped forward, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "Leonard Davis, you're under arrest for the assault, manipulation, and emotional abuse of several women. You have the right to remain silent." Leonard's face twisted in anger. "This is a mistake. I've done nothing wrong. I'm innocent." His voice rose, desperate now, as if trying to convince himself more than the officers. But the officers weren't listening. They knew the truth. And Leonard's protests fell on deaf ears as they moved in, cuffing him and leading him toward the door. Elaine stood across the street, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She watched as Leonard was led out of his apartment, his face now a mixture of rage and disbelief. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and she saw the fury in his gaze. But there was something else too, a hint of fear. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to fight back. "You think you won?" Leonard spat, his voice low and venomous. "You're nothing, just a pawn in my game." Elaine didn't flinch. She stood tall, her chin lifted, every ounce of her being focused on this moment, the culmination of everything she had fought for. The moment when the tables had finally turned, when she was no longer the victim, but the victor. "No, Leonard," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I'm not a pawn. I'm the one who took you down." The officers pushed Leonard into the back of the police car, slamming the door shut with a finality that made Elaine's heart skip a beat. The sirens wailed once more as the car sped off into the night, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elaine let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. She had done it. She had exposed him for who he truly was, and now he was finally facing the consequences. But the satisfaction of seeing Leonard arrested was more than just about his punishment. It was about reclaiming her own power, about taking back the control he had stolen from her. Leonard had thought he could manipulate and break her, but she had proven him wrong. She had fought back, outsmarted him at his own game, and in the end, she had brought him to justice. As the police cars disappeared into the night, Elaine stood there for a moment longer, allowing herself to savor the feeling of victory. It was over. Leonard had lost, and she was free. But even as the last of the sirens faded into the distance, Elaine knew that the battle for her peace was far from over. The scars of what Leonard had done would take time to heal, and the memories of his manipulation would linger in the back of her mind. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hope, a real, solid hope that she could rebuild her life, that she could move forward. And as she turned to walk away, the weight that had been holding her down for so long finally lifted, leaving her lighter, freer, and ready for whatever came next. The nightmare was over, and Elaine had won.